Our gun laws in Canada have changed dramatically over the past few years. But with everyone concerned about what's going to be taken from us next, it's pretty easy to forget about how things used to be. Let's have a look. Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be taking a brief look at the history of gun control legislation in Canada. This video was sort of a request from a viewer, and actually from a number of other people over my last few videos here. More than a couple of you have wondered just how far we've fallen over the years in terms of firearms legislation here in Canada. I was always planning to do this video, but since a number of people have been asking for it recently, and seeing as we're likely on the verge of another set of polarizing changes in the near future here, I think now is as good a time as any. Now, for what it's worth, I'm not super familiar with the history of firearms legislation outside of the past 30 years, pretty much since the Firearms Act, and even within the last 30 years, some of my knowledge is a little bit spotty in some areas. But I did come across this resource a few months ago while doing research for other videos, and I think it paints a pretty good picture of where we've come from and where the slow, progressive march of gun control is headed. It goes all the way back to 1892, which is actually pretty close to Confederation. And it even predates some of the provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan. So as far as history goes, I think that's a pretty solid place to start. And our source information for this is the RCMP. That being said, about a quarter of my viewers on this channel are over the age of 50, and I imagine some of you are probably quite a bit older than even that. So if there's anything you wish to add to the RCMP's history here, by all means put it down in the comments. Like maybe we can get a sort of second history thread going in the comments from people who have actually lived through a lot of these changes themselves, and perhaps this video on YouTube can serve as part of that history to be immortalized on the internet. So let's get to it. I'm basically just going to summarize this document from top to bottom, starting from the 19th century and getting more recent as we go. And I'll be showing everything on screen as I go through it, but pause to read it in more detail if you want, as I may not go over every single line here. There is also a link to this document in the description below if anyone wants to read it for themselves in their own time. So this is the history of firearms legislation in Canada, according to the RCMP. Before 1892, you weren't allowed to carry a handgun if you didn't have reasonable cause to fear assault against your life or property. And this carried merely a 6-month jail term if you were non-compliant. Most interesting to me here is that you were allowed to carry a handgun for protection of not only yourself, but also your property. In 1892, this changed a little bit, where the criminal code then required a permit in order to carry a handgun unless you had cause to fear for your safety, which feels like a bit of an honor system to me. With these changes, vendors also had to collect information regarding all handgun and airgun sales, but this isn't a federal database of any kind, so this isn't the beginning of the registry just yet. In 1913, that honor system ended and an official permitting system was required to carry a handgun outside of your home or business. And for anyone who doesn't know what carry means, carry doesn't mean transport or move. Carry means ready to go on your person, typically in a holster. This page never actually differentiates between concealed carry and open carry, so we can't really know if it was one or the other, but these permits probably specified which was allowed. They also limited the age of firearm ownership to 16 or older, and the government created the first property confiscation powers for firearms and other weapons. Then between 1919 and 1920, the federal government required everyone to get permits in order to acquire firearms, but this didn't apply to firearms they already owned. And these permits were only valid for 1 year after the date they were issued, which is pretty ridiculous. Like, could you imagine having to renew your license every year in order to have firearms? Well, neither could they, because in 1921, they repealed that law and instead made that a requirement only for non-Canadians. And this is really the first example we see of gun control taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Even when the previous governments of Canada have acknowledged that they went too far or that a law was nonsensical, they rarely, if ever, completely revert the law. You're going to see more examples of this as we go, but usually they only repeal a portion of the problematic legislation while keeping the groundwork to be built upon later, which is a pretty relevant observation considering the state of gun control in Canada today. And then a decade later, in 1932, the government decided that people weren't free enough to decide on their own if they wanted a handgun, and that from now on, they needed to have a reason before they were allowed to have a handgun. Now, interestingly enough here, back then, a completely valid reason for owning handguns was for protection of life or property in addition to sport shooting. So this idea that we always hear about having firearms to protect yourself or property being a solely American concept is completely ridiculous. It was a completely normal thing in Canada less than a century ago, and these laws actually stay on the books for quite a while, so it's a lot more recent than even that. At this time, the government also changed the minimum age for firearm ownership from 16 down to 12, and updated some criminal penalties related to the carrying or concealing of a firearm. And these penalties are actually rather interesting, because these penalties demonstrate very clearly where the government's priorities are even back then. Having a handgun on you while you're actively committing a crime added only 2 years to your sentence, but having a handgun on you simply without a permit, while you're otherwise not doing anything else wrong, was up to 5 years on its own. So if you believe in the myth that the government implements gun control for the sake of public safety, then this must mean that the government believed it was more dangerous to simply not have a handgun permit than it was to actively use a handgun in the commission of a crime. Moving on to 1934, the first real registration process for firearms took place regarding handguns only. These registration records weren't centralized yet, and they were only kept at local RCMP or police detachments, which kind of makes sense because computers weren't invented yet back then, so national database gathering was much more difficult. And then in 1939, you had to re-register your handguns every 5 years, and the government added or changed a few of the firearm-related sentences. And this is important to note as we go forward here. The RCMP has been making note, and will continue to make a note, of firearm-related offenses changing as time goes on. Which, I mean, that's pretty fair considering that this page is a history of firearms-related legislation, and it makes perfect sense that they should be mentioning such things. But do keep that in mind for later. And then, not a whole lot of anything changes over the next 30 years. During World War II, the government postponed re-registration of handgun certificates and required the registration of rifles and shotguns, but these things were reverted back after the war ended. In 1947, they expanded parts of the criminal code dealing with constructive murder to specifically mention firearms offenses. In 1950, registration certificates became valid indefinitely, and in 1951, the registration became centralized in the RCMP. You then also had to register automatic firearms, and these firearms had to have serial numbers. In 1968 is when things start to get spicy. The RCMP page doesn't tell you this, but this was when Trudeau Sr. got elected, and most of the nonsense we see next is his handiwork. We start seeing the first indicators of what later becomes the Firearms Act coming into play as the government created what are essentially the 3 firearm categories that we still have today: prohibited weapons, restricted weapons, and ordinary firearms. And this allowed the government to more specifically legislate against certain types of firearms, and this was the beginning of the infamous Order and Council powers, which allow Cabinet to unilaterally prescribe firearms as restricted or prohibited. They also increased the age of minor permits back up to 16 years of age, and then in '69, the current registration scheme also came into effect. And something else very interesting also happened during this time. Canada brought in its first red flag laws in 1968. For the first time in Canadian history, police had the authority to search for and seize firearms if they believed an individual was a danger to themselves or others, even though no actual offense had been committed. So when Trudeau and Polievre, or whatever other gun control group says that we needed C-21 in order to get red flag laws instituted in Canada, that was an absolute bold-faced garbage lie. So if you ever see anyone spouting that nonsense, be sure to send them this video. Canada has had clear-cut, solid red flag laws for well over 50 years now. Which, I mean, that's not news. We've been saying this the whole time, but it's worth remembering. And it's tough to believe that Justin Trudeau really didn't know about this because A, how could he not? And B, his daddy was the one who brought these red flag laws into force. And then in 1977, Pierre Trudeau's government passed legislation which required everyone who wanted to acquire firearms to have a Firearms Acquisition Certificate, otherwise known as an FAC, which is the precursor to the modern Possession and Acquisition License, the PAL, or the PAL. He also created licenses for businesses and created the Chief Firearms Officer positions in the provinces. Now, I wish the RCMP's record here went into a bit more detail on this front, but Pierre Trudeau also enacted new firearms-related offenses, enhanced search and seizure powers, increased penalties, and new definitions for restricted and prohibited weapons. But we don't get any kind of real specifics on what exactly these powers are, or those penalties are, or anything like that. And this is also when automatic firearms were banned, but that came into force later in the following year in 1978. So not only did Pierre Trudeau bring in red flag laws in 1968, but he also appears to have enhanced them again in 1977. So Justin Trudeau saying that Canada needs red flag laws in the 21st century, I mean, that's just complete nonsense. But this does also help shine a light on where Trudeau Jr. gets his fanatical delusions on gun control from. He would have grown up in an environment where his daddy taught him all about the evils that firearms were, and how beneficial it can be politically to manipulate that, and that the only good firearm is a banned firearm. As the saying goes, boys grow up to become their dads, and that is certainly the case here. However, even Pierre Trudeau had the sense to increase penalties and mandatory minimums on those involved in violent firearm-related crimes, not to decrease them. So it seems Junior really only learned the wrong half of this lesson from his daddy. Now, I don't know about you, but I was actually kind of surprised to learn about all of this. I knew a little bit of the political history and some of what Pierre Trudeau had done, but I didn't know that there was this much overlap between Pierre Trudeau and Justin Trudeau's gun control policies. I thought the whole purpose of ripping down monarchies and replacing them with democracies was to prevent a single family and their delusions from oppressing their subjects. But it seems Canadian society never really learned that lesson. But back to the history of firearms legislation. Nothing much else changed until the 90s. And from here on out, I'm going to speed up a little bit because I think most people watching this video are reasonably familiar with the Firearms Act and the more recent legislative changes. But I also want to point out to you just how long these sections actually get. This page covers the entire history of Canada since Confederation. So the record for the first 100 or 20 years or so of Canada only covers about a third of the page, whereas the last 30 years make up the bulk of the document. So I think that really demonstrates, really more than anything else, just how ridiculous things are getting, and how we shouldn't expect or believe that this time will be the end of gun control either, despite the empty promises from politicians and other gun control types. So between 1991 and 1994, a number of things changed. They updated the FACs to require photographs, safety training, expanded background checks, and imposed mandatory waiting periods on FAC applications. Now again, these were all things that Justin Trudeau lied about doing, because once again, they were all implemented decades ago. Not only did he lie about that, but other things happened during this time. Back in the 90s, the government also banned so-called large capacity magazines and prohibited most military and paramilitary rifles. Things that, again, Trudeau is claiming to be doing today. During this time, and especially later on after the introduction of the Firearms Act in 1995, the government required that new safety courses also cover firearm laws in addition to the safety issues. Even the gun control governments of the past understood that the laws they were passing were becoming so complex and confusing and difficult to follow that people couldn't be expected to adhere to them without deliberate instruction and education on them. And things have only really gotten much worse since then. And then in 1995, the government introduced a ton of other changes with the newly enacted Firearms Act and significant amendments to the criminal code. It wasn't all bad though. Among other things, they once again understood that the primary issue was the criminal misuse of firearms in Canada. And so they increased penalties on violent criminals, most of which were still in effect until Justin Trudeau decided that punishing violent criminals for doing dangerous and harmful things wasn't the sort of Canada that we should live in. The Firearms Act abolished the FAC system and implemented the current PAL system, and it also required that all firearms now be registered, including long guns. The Firearms Act now also very strictly regulated the transportation, storage, and use of all classes of firearms, and allowed carry permits, now called an authorization to carry, only in very limited circumstances. It also strictly regulated firearm businesses, placed additional record-keeping requirements on them, and placed license and registration-based provisions on all transfers of firearms between private individuals. Most of the Firearms Act and its related regulatory provisions came into force by the end of 1998. However, some of the new licensing provisions weren't instituted until later in 2001. In 2003, some tweaks were made to the Firearms Act. Perhaps most notably, control of the Canadian Firearms Centre was removed from the RCMP and it was given to the Solicitor General. However, that was fairly short-lived, and by 2006, Stephen Harper had come into power and he sent that back to the control of the RCMP under the newly branded Canadian Firearms Program, the CFP. Over the next few years, even with a Conservative government at the helm, Harper really didn't do much on the firearms front until 2012, when he finally ended the long gun registry and simplified private transfers of such long guns, now classified as non-restricted firearms. However, Quebec kept their records and still requires their residents to register all of their firearms. And that was basically all Harper did for us. So again, we see this sort of one step forward and two steps backwards problem. Gun control really has only ever traveled in one direction in Canada. And to be fair, not everything that the Firearms Act does or aims to do is bad necessarily, but there's a lot more wrong with it than just the long gun registry. And this is kind of a concern I have with Pierre Polievre if he ever comes into power with a majority. Like, we need solutions, real solutions, to some of the oppression that we're actively facing. But if history is any indicator, he's only likely to repeal some of this nonsense, and only some of the more recent nonsense. But we need change. Like, we need real and substantial change. I know he has promised some big things like repealing the OIC gun bans, repealing C-21, eliminating the OIC gun ban powers, and implementing a simplified classification system. I mean, all of these, they're all good things. But to truly fix things, we really need more than that. Like, even if he does all of that, it's not much more than a band-aid measure or a stopgap. And I'm going to be sure to do a video discussing what I would like to see and what I think needs to be changed, but there's not much sense doing such a video until after an election happens. And at the very least, it's not the topic of today's video, so we're going to move on. From here on out, it's mostly the story you know. In 2015, Justin Trudeau got into power and immediately began his gun control plans, where he enacted Bill C-42, which was a comparatively minor bill for the most part. But then in 2019, the nonsense that was Bill C-71 was enacted. In 2020, the first OIC gun bans came out, which banned over 1,500 models of so-called assault-style firearms. In 2022, the handgun freeze came into effect, and in 2023, Bill C-21 received royal assent, enshrining that handgun freeze into legislation. C-21 also promised to implement red flag laws, among a whole slew of other things, but again, this record already stated that red flag laws were implemented in the 60s. So these new red flag laws actually aren't new red flag laws. In actuality, they are laws stripping away annoyances like due process and privacy rights and so on. But, as we all know, firearms owners have no rights in Canada, so I guess that's just not really an issue, I suppose. And that brings us to today. Most recently, we've had additional firearm bans in December, and are likely to see more sometimes this month in February. However, there is a lot of information missing from the RCMP's record here, which I think points to a bias against us gun owners. For example, all throughout this page, the RCMP has made a point of discussing when penalties regarding violent firearms offenses have changed. However, this report makes no mention of bills like Bill C-5, which eliminated mandatory minimum sentences for a whole slew of firearms offenses, including robbery with a firearm, extortion with a firearm, and discharging with intent. Like, that's a pretty significant change to firearms-related penalties, which the RCMP just opted not to mention in their supposed record here. So who knows what other firearms-related nonsense they've left out. Also, in 1977, when they first introduced the firearms license, the FACs, they said that these new licenses were the biggest changes that were made, and that, the other minor changes were things like enhanced search and seizure powers and the significant banning of certain firearms. So from that sort of tone, we can tell that the RCMP, or at least the portion that was responsible for creating this record, is very anti-gun as well. In their mind, the increased restrictions and control is automatically good, and the banning or seizing of firearms from innocent law-abiding individuals is really not that big of a deal. So in case anybody needs reminding, the administrative portions of the RCMP are very political in Canada. They are not on our side. And when I say our side, I don't even necessarily mean the pro-gun side. I mean the rights and freedoms of all Canadians side. the RCMP really shouldn't be trusted any more than the government is. Now, all in all, though, I think this is a fairly accurate account of what has happened in relation to firearms laws in Canada since Confederation. If nothing else, it's certainly a good indicator of where we've come from and where we're headed. If any of you are on the older end of the spectrum and have lived through any of this, especially the pre-Firearms Act era of firearms legislation, I'd love to hear from you in the comment section down below about the things that this record maybe just doesn't cover, or specifics to some of the things that it glosses over. For example, this record never actually states when protection of life and property stopped being a valid reason for firearm ownership. Like, a lot of this is hardly ancient history. My dad has told me stories of him growing up in the bush in northern Saskatchewan, and carrying handguns and other firearms was still plenty common for him and his community, just even back then. So a century ago, the only real rule related to firearms ownership was don't take your handguns out in public without good reason. And then within about 100 years, we went from that to licenses, registration, training courses, safe storage, background check, mental health checks, mandatory waiting periods, red flag laws, gun bans, capacity limitations, and more. Yet despite all of that, the government is still saying that we can't be trusted and that people shouldn't be allowed to buy firearms for sporting use in a controlled manner at a federally regulated gun range. The 2020 OIC and the handgun freeze are aimed directly at stomping out sport shooting and sending these dangerous sport shooting lunatics to jail if they don't comply. That's a pretty radical change that happened in less than a century, and in reality, most of that change has happened in the past 50 years. Again, this is not ancient history. And that's kind of the end of the history lesson. But to end this video on a more positive note, anyone who has any ideas for videos or would like me to discuss certain topics, feel free to let me know what and why in the comments below my videos. My channel is still small enough to where I read most of them. And I'm not hurting for video ideas or anything like that. Like, I still got dozens of projects and stuff on the go. But if enough of you ask for a particular video or topic, it may be worth bumping that to the front of the line for you guys. So, get vocal in the comments section and let's get some conversations going. All that being said, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.